Well, I am Lady Serena Calandra. I am in Adler's room, which is in the far north corner of the kingdom. I don't get out a whole lot, but I do love to weave and I do all different types of weaving. I don't have any recently completed tapestry pieces. Most of what I've done with tapestry weaving was making small bags and little things to hang on my wall when I was a teenager and in college, and making little purses and pouches. There are some samples of some little tiny pieces in the handout, which I'm going to share again in the chat. Well, it's not laid out in the best way, but it's the best that I can do at the moment here. So tapestry weaving is weaving shapes and designs into cloth. The examples that you're often familiar with in period are the unicorn tapestries. Those are gigantic and were actually woven by teams of people, and it could take a month to weave a foot, and it's very fine threads. And they're very beautiful and great examples. If you're looking at something that you might want to look at as an idea for an A&S entry, or something that is more easily able to reproduce in a style, I do recommend looking at the pre-Columbian South American, especially Andean textiles. Peru, the area that is now Peru, has a lot of good examples, very bright and colorful geometric shapes and figures. There's a lot of birds and other animals that appear in it, and they're of a size that it's a little bit easier to reproduce. There are also some examples of Coptic weaving found in Egypt, that some of them there's debates that apparently I learned last night whether things were embroidered or woven in, and some are a mix. So that tread carefully with that. But there's a few pictures, for example, in the handout that are linked to places. I don't want to show that because of it being recorded here, but I do invite you to look at that. There's also some books mentioned there that I found useful, with a lot of examples of tapestries and different styles, especially the Peruvian and Andean textiles. Getting started, this is one thing that you can get started probably with whatever you already have in the house. There are many different options that you can use for looms. You can buy a fancy loom specifically for tapestry weaving. The modern ones will sometimes have devices where you can have multiple sheds set up and have notches or something else to be able to differentiate the spacing between your warp threads. You can use something as simple as a piece of cardboard, or take two sticks together, or sorry, four sticks. Well, actually, you can do two together, because you can use a backstrap loom also. And a backstrap loom is where one end is anchored to you and the other end is anchored to a fixed point. And in Peru and many other South American countries, that is actually how they wove in period, and still do to this day. Another example of a period loom that was used in the Andes is they would take four stakes and put them in 4 sticks and stick them in the ground, and then tie another 4 sticks around that, and then anchor the weaving between 2 sticks. We would attach it to 2 sticks like you do with a backstrap loom, and then attach that to that frame of the 4 sticks and just sit on the ground and weave that way. So you have a lot of options. The one I'm going to show you is just some simple little looms that I got cheap at a craft store that are good for just trying out different techniques to start out with. So some basic terminology with weaving. And I'm going to switch to the weaving view so I can show some of these items. Okay. So you have your loom. The vertical threads that go around the loom, that is your warp thread. The threads that you weave with, that is your weft. This is considered a weft-based weave because the thread that you weave with formed your pattern, versus tablet weaving and a lot of inkle weaving are warp-faced weaves, where how you warp the loom ends up making your pattern. And how you manipulate that will make your pattern. Things that you often may use are shuttles to hold your loom, or to hold your weft thread to pass through. Shuttles come in many different sizes and shapes. I do recommend finding a shuttle that that covers the entire width of your weaving. Unless you're using a really large loom, then you may have to use smaller shuttles. This is mainly going to be used for some of your rows to start off with at the bottom and also on the top. And I realize that the closed captioning is affecting the visibility. So let me see if I can raise this up a moment, because I don't want to turn off the closed captioning. Okay, that's a little bit better. Now you can see things a little bit easier on that. I also want to have some needles. Weaving needles and yarn needles come in many different sizes, shapes, and materials. You can get them in bone or wood. This is technically actually made with one of those laser printer things. And plastic. Those are the easiest ones to come by. You can easily find in the craft section or sewing section about any craft store. Also have some metal ones. You want to have lots of needles around, so you're not having to change needles with each thread. As you see, I have several threads that are coming off of this piece, that you're going to have that happen. You can also get specific tapestry bobbins. They are pointed on the end and have a space for you to be able to wrap the thread around it, or the yarn. And those are helpful. They're very similar to bobbin lace bobbins, only they tend to be a little bit thicker. If you're using thin yarns, you could use bobbin lace bobbins if you have those around. A thing that I like is this point turner that you can find in the quilt sections at craft stores. It's got a hole at the top so you can tie your yarn onto it and wrap it around, but it's got a point, so it makes it easy to be able to get in and out of the threads. Something else that can be helpful is what's called a beater. These come in a lot of forms. You can even use a comb if you don't have one. This is what I have. What this is for beating down the threads. In some tapestry pieces, you won't have a need for it, but for some parts of it, you may. Something else that's helpful is called a shed stick. So I have this fancy one with the arrow that I'm using here, but what this is it's woven over and under, wove through, so that I can raise it up, and that opens up what's called the shed. The shed is where your shuttle or needle can pass through with the yarn. And so that opens up for one shed, and then I lay that down, and then the opposite one I would have to come weave through with my needle. For the most part, you're going to be doing over and under, but there's different ways of how we're going to create our patterns here. Okay, and I'm going to raise that up again. There we go. Okay. So getting started, different looms are going to be warped differently. I do recommend looking at instructions that come with your loom if you bought one. There are also a lot of instructions out there on how to warp a loom if you're using cardboard or something like that. I'll briefly show a little bit of what I would do with cardboard. I actually recommend, if you're doing cardboard, punching a hole in the side so that you can probably somewhere down about here, not quite halfway, but a little bit 2/3 of the way. Because if you punch a hole through it, then that gives you a good anchor point to tie your yarn onto, and also to be able to adjust tension. Because that's one thing that some tapestry looms do lack, is the ability to adjust tension, but you really do need to be able to do that. Because as you weave, particularly your end warp threads tend to have problems with tension. They either get pulled in too tight or they may loosen up. So what I've done on here when I use a frame loom is I tie a knot that I can easily adjust, that I can slide down if I need to, or tie additional knots. So I just tied through the loop twice. So it's not a fixed knot. I can easily adjust that. So if I was doing on this one, all I have available to do is just to tie onto one of the corners, which you do have to watch on that. And you can, and this is one that I bought, but you can easily make your own with cardboard, just measuring equal distance. Picture frames that are sturdy will also work, because you don't actually have to have any notches or anything. You can just wrap things directly. And there are ways that you can help make the spaces between your warp threads. It's called the set. And you can do that without having to have built-in spacers on there. So I'm going to show how we get started. And when you're just starting out, I think it's okay to tie your thread to tie your weft onto your warp. But I know some people will say you should never tie a knot. So there are ways around it. But if you are tying a knot, or even if you're not, you do want to leave at least 6 inches of tail for your starting thread. I'm going to show without doing a knot. So we're going to pretend that this is the beginning of a piece. And there are some different ways that you can start. You could just do over and under for a few rows. You can, but if you need to make your spaces more even, which I needed to do on here because I warped all the way around front and back. And so you can tie sumac knots to make that even spacing between your warp threads. So I'm just going to leave my thread here. So I went under this one, and I'm going to go, I need to make a knot. Okay, actually for this one to start it, I am going to tie a knot because it makes it easy to start that. But I left my tail. That can be incorporated later. But I'm going to go behind the next thread and get everything tangled up, because that happens. Okay. Sorry, it's been a while since I've done this one. Tying the first knot is the difficult part there. Okay. So now I'm going to go behind on each one for my knots. And when I get to this loop here, I'm just going to go through that loop. It's important to make sure that they're going the same direction each time. And see, as I go, I'm going to go behind another one here. The sumac knots can be tied different directions. It's just a matter of you keep going the same way and it will start forming the little pattern. But this is just for the getting started. This is a way to make that even spacing on your threads. Something that was done with a lot of the Peruvian weaving is they tried to weave with 4 selvages and not have any room for fringe or anything like that. And so they often will use a thicker cotton cord and weave 2 or 3 rows with that cord on both the bottom and the top of the loom, so that they have their selvages set for that. And then, of course, as you're weaving, you set the selvages for the other 2 sides. Now, one thing with materials for warp, I like using cotton, and cotton is actually period when we're talking about the Andean textiles, and also some Egyptian. cotton was actually used for the warp. In the Andean weaving, they tend to use camelid fibers for weaving. Other areas of the world, wool, other wools and silk, linen were all things that would be used, but cotton and camelid are the most common that were used in Andean textiles. So that was just a demonstration on showing how to start setting your spacing, your set for your threads. Now, if you want to bring on a piece to start to weave, and that's where I'm going to just come in here. My previous row here, I was behind, so I'm going to start going over. Whichever direction you weave is up to you. You can weave right to left, left to right, whichever is more comfortable for you. Now, with some of the techniques I'm going to show, you're going to end up weaving both directions. That's part of why you need to have multiple needles. So I'm going over and under. And technically, this is my main shed, so I can just raise that up. And pull that through to the point that I want it to. Now, when you're first starting, you do want to weave a couple rows of just plain weave over and under all the way across. That will help keep that set even and help set things up for you. So I'm going to leave my tail. I'm not going to tie a knot. This is where you would beat down your thread so it's next to the thread below it. And then I'm going to go, for this one, I want to go back. So I'm going to go over this thread because I went under it the last time. So just going over and under, the opposite of what I just did in the previous row. You'll be able to tell if you end up making a mistake with it, because if your thread is laying right directly on top of the thread from the previous row, then you know that you just need to take that out and try that again. So with this second thread, I'm going to do what's called bubbling. This is where you leave a little bit of space instead of just pulling it tight, and push it down gently. You may have to pull a little bit, but you want to watch it, because if you pull too tight, see how I've made this wider gap here. And so that undoes your set and can cause issues. That's why when you look at some pictures of tapestry weaving for modern tapestry, you'll see a lot of times where it starts becoming like an hourglass. It's because they're pulling too tight on the edges. And bubbling will help give you a little bit of give so that that doesn't happen. And so for my next row, this tail here, there's two things that I could do with it. One is I can just leave it and then weave it in at the end. Another is that I can carry it up the side and incorporate it in my next row. That can be a little difficult, and sometimes I'll do that for a couple of rows and then just bury it after that. So this one I'm just going to do a little bit over, and I'm going to go over one more row than I did the last time. All right, so this is where I have to watch things, and I'm trying to make sure that my tail gets caught in that loop there. But I don't want to pull everything too tight, or I'm going to get that hourglass forming. That's where I just beat that down. Another thing to watch is the size of yarn you're using in relation to your warp. A rule of thumb that some people like to use is if you lay the yarn in between your warp threads, there should be just a little bit of space on each side of it. Then you've got a good sizing for it. This one is actually almost a little too thick, but it is kind of tight and still does bury the warp, because you want to see your warp threads. This thread is a little bit thinner and does go over it a little bit better, but you have to watch it. It does have a little bit more give in it. What I'm using on the right side is cotton. I love this cotton and sugar and cream, depending on what store it came from. What's on the left side, the blue and yellow, is pallet yarn from Knit Picks, and it is wool. And it is a good one for weaving for tapestries and comes in a variety of colors. Okay, so we wove 2 rows of plain weave, is what that is, without doing any pattern, and you're just going over and under. So now I have to look at how do we incorporate more colors or designs in here. So you have a lot of different options on what you can do. One method is called stacking, or also dovetailing, which is what this green and gray are doing. So every other one is alternating which one goes over this thread, and it forms that little pattern there, like dovetailing. Another thing that is done sometimes is called slit weaving. You'll find this in a lot of the South American textiles. So I'm going to bring this further. So right here, there is actually a hole because the yellow is all woven up to this point and the blue is woven to this point. And then periodically, like every 5 or 6 rows, or sometimes even longer, you do need to attach them to each other. And so that's done with something called interlacing, which I'm going to demonstrate here in a moment, where that blue and yellow are going through each other so that they connect. And then we have some other things. So this is the meet and depart thing that's mentioned on the handout. So I'll show that here in a moment. And you can also use different patterns and things to create different effects on there. This is the columns area that's mentioned on the handout. And that's just done by alternating, weaving 1 row of green, then 1 row of brown. And then at one point I switched, I did a solid row of brown and then started alternating the green and brown again. And that offsets things of how you're doing things. Or doing a dash line, like down here with the blue and yellow. With weaving patterns, you have to remember the simple theory. 2 colors or 2 threads of the same color make a solid line. So call that color A. You have 2 lines of A, that's a solid line. If you weave just one line of B, then you're going to end up with a dashed line. So 2 rows of A, 1 row of B, and then 2 rows of A is going to give you the dashed line. Or if you do the alternating, you're going to get stripes. So to keep that in mind, if you're wanting solid colors, make sure you have 2 rows of the same color next to each other. But using some of those alternating colors can actually help give effects, because if you say weave alternating rows of red and blue, if you're standing back from that from about 15 feet or so, it actually does blend a bit to give an appearance of purple. And that was sometimes used as an effect to create more colors, was to have the alternating color rows like that. Okay, so then also for managing all of your different colors that you may have out, sometimes it's helpful to make a little butterfly with your yarn. And you can use that to weave in and out directly. I mostly just use the butterflies for storage. I'll take the butterfly out when I'm working because it's just easier for me to do that. So since I have this blue and yellow set up already for what's called meet and depart, I'm going to demonstrate that one first. Go ahead and get my yarn threaded here. This is one way of having your colors meet up together and to give different effects. It can be used to create different geometric shapes. What these red points here are, this is the method that I'm going to show now of how to create something like that. And so for this, you need to have your 2 different colors. You're going to weave from both directions, one at a time, and meet in the middle. So I'm going to weave my blue first. This is where you have to be careful of your sets. Make sure to bubble. Beat that down. And then I'm going to have my yellow come from the other direction. And so there's this thread right here in the middle that they're meeting at. This is the meat part of this. So this is where you have to choose which one is going to go over that thread and which one isn't. I'm going to have the blue is going to go over this thread that they're meeting at. So I'm going over it, but then I'm also going under it at the same time because I'm going to weave back the other direction. So it's going to loop around that thread that the yarns were meeting at. And pull that back through. So then the yellow is ready to go back the way that it came. Yeah. See, sometimes I have to make sure I'm going the right way here. So they're really just next to each other. Now, if on the next row, if I just wove them to the same point, that's going to make a slit. But we're going to show, but that's not the way that I'm trying to go with this one. So now I'm going to weave my next row. And I'm going to go one more than I did the row before. Take the yellow and have it meet up. See, this is the thread that they're meeting at. See, I was pulling too tight there on my edge. It was trying to come in a little too much there. And so this is where I'm going to have the blue go over again. So it's starting to make that little step up there. This is also, sometimes it's called meet and depart, and sometimes it's called meet and separate, depending on what book you're reading there. But that's creating that gradual change in the colors. And go back. So that's one way that you can start trying to create shapes. Now, if you're wanting to do something complex, recommend making what's called a cartoon, where you draw out the pattern that you want. Simple shapes are the best thing to do. And you can place that behind your loom. Depending on the loom, you might be able to tape it to the loom. Some people would tape it to the side. You do want to make it in reverse though, because the side that you're weaving on is actually generally going to be the back of your piece with that. So you want to make sure any of the threads that you bury into it, you're going to do that on what's going to be the back. We'll go over a little more of that here in a little bit. So now I'm going to show what it looks like to do a different method. Sorry, I have too many pieces of yarn here. Okay. So now we're going to show what it looks like to stack them or do the dovetail. So I'm going to weave back over to where they would meet again. that beat down there. Okay. That woven there. So this time I am going to have, make sure which way I want to do this. Okay, I'm going to weave the yellow over this one in the middle that they were meeting at. And then the blue is going to go on top of this yellow one. So it starts stacking on top of each other, and you would alternate which one goes on top where. And I will made a mistake in my weaving, so I'm going to undo that. Just go back through part of the path there. And so with the stacking and dovetailing, you just alternate which one goes on top of each other. Now, if we were trying to do the interlacing, show that next here. Not unweave what I was just weaving. If you make mistakes, you just take it out and you start over again, because it happens. Especially when you're dealing with fine yarns. Okay. So this time I'm going to weave them where they meet up again. Notice I didn't go all the way back over because I'm kind of creating where I could make a different shape there. So you can fill in different areas. Now, you don't want to just weave like a shape up here and then have something down here, because that can affect your tension and how things join together and be difficult to fill in. So you want to weave as you go. You may end up having 3 or 4 different colors that going at the same time if you have different areas that need to meet up. So I have these that are kind of together around the same place. Watch the edges there. So this time I'm going to put the yellow over another one and go back. I'm not going to pull this all the way yet because I'm going to do an interlace with this. Always come from the same direction. I prefer to come from the bottom. So I'm going to take the blue, is going to go up through this loop for the yellow. Most sturdy loom here. Usually I would weave with this in my lap with this type of loom. Watch the edging beat down. But that blue is going through that loop of yellow. So that's the interlacing. I'm going to show an example of that. So on this one here, this purple and green, they are interlaced as how they join. You can kind of see they're going through each other. That's a little darker. It's a little clearer on the handout. But those are some of the basic ways of making your shapes and different things that you can do. You'll find that depending on what shape you're doing, may determine which method you want to use for the joining. And some you can have be kind of a little bit smooth or be rugged depending on what you're trying to depict. Now this one I did use the Sumac Knots as a textural thing, which that's a modern thing to add texture in. It's not as common to see that in anything in period. I did see where there was a hat that was woven with tapestry techniques, but they used lark's head knots and then cut it to create a pile. But it's a similar type of thing. So sometimes there was texture, but not like you see in the modern tapestries with the thick roving and things like that. That is definitely a more modern creation on there. But you can use as fine threads as you want or thick, depending on what you're wanting to do. See how we started getting our shape there. Now, if you were needing to start a thread in the middle of the piece, you can do that. It doesn't have to be on the edge, because sometimes you're going to start your shape in the middle. So you would just pick the point that you want to start and just make sure to leave your tail and use whichever method of joining that you want to do. Like this slit here, how that was joined is it's a row of interlacing, and then you could repeat doing a slit or something like that. Now, if you are running out of thread or yarn and you need to start a new one, there are a few ways that you can do that with ending the thread. So let me go back to my edge here and show that. And so you can do it in the middle, or you can do it on the edge. It just depends. But since I have my tail on there, I'm going to pretend my tail is a new piece of yarn that I was adding. And so what you would do is you weave both the new thread and the old thread over a couple of the weft threads together. So let me get that started here. And it doesn't have to be both at the same time. You could do one and then put the other just directly on top of it, which I think I'm going to do here will be easier. So I'm just going to weave a couple places there. And then I would pretend that's a new thread I was adding, or this could be the old thread that I'm trying to bury, because you can also bury your tail ends this way too. That would work. I can get it to stay on the needle. And so I'm just going to follow the same path that I did for the other piece. Now with the thicker yarn, it is a little bit more noticeable, but I'm going to try to arrange it to where they're kind of laying on top of each other, so you don't really see it as two pieces directly on top of each other. I'm kind of pushing that forward a little bit. And so that's one way that you can add in a new thread and then just keep weaving with the new one. And then this tail end, that's where you do what you do with a lot of needlework. You have to weave in your ends or bury them in the piece. That one's getting a little frayed there. And that's where I'm just going to find a spot. And just push it down into the piece, and then you could cut it off. Usually I would go a little bit farther than just a couple rows, but that's just burying your ends into your piece. You want to make sure that it's not visible on the other side, that it's only visible on one side, so that you don't end up going through the outside. So here's this is what will end up being the front of the finished piece. And so you don't see the ends that are buried into it. Now, On this one, we're getting started. I did leave some room at the bottom. That is your preference, whether you want to weave it all the way to the edge and have just a selvage edge for both sides, or whether you want to leave room to have some fringe. If you do end up leaving any sort of fringe, then you would need to weave those ends in at the end or make them decorative, depending on what you're doing with it. This is my example of showing weaving in the bottom threads up here. I just haven't cut that off yet. When taking the piece off the loom, there are a few different ways that you can do it. If you are using one that has nails on the edge or some sort of loop and you're only doing it one way, you can pull the loops over each other, kind of like binding off with crochet or knitting. But it does make it really tight on the bottom edge. Just trying to see if I had, okay, there's one. It's a little hard to see with this yarn, but that's what I did on this end, is one loop is pulled through the other till you get to the end, and then tying the ends together, opening up the final loop. You can just cut it directly off, and then you can tie your ends together. There are different ways to do that. Sometimes I'll use a square knot, sometimes you use a double overhand knot, just tying 2 or 3 threads together. And that just makes simple fringe, which is kind of more modern. A lot of times the fringes that you see are actually added on after the piece is taken off, as in you would weave in these ends and then add an external fringe. And so there's different ways that you can look into doing that. Okay, so we went over some basics on what you can do for starting out some basic shapes. If you do want to try this and have questions, I can be found on Facebook as Miranda Moore. The easiest way to find me there. But there are a lot of good tutorials out there right now. Tapestry weaving is kind of hitting a popularity with modern things right now. So there are a lot of places that you can find simple, cheap looms for, and they'll usually have some basic directions on it. But there are some books to look in out there. And I do recommend, if you are a fiber arts fan, looking at that 5,000 Years of Textiles that I put in the handout. That does have some basics and show some diagrams, but it has all kinds of different textiles, weaving, embroidery through the ages. It's a good resource to look at. And do you have any questions? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.